Everyone loves Fahrenheit 451. Am I right, baby? Let's do some reading. They said nothing on their way back to the firehouse. Nobody looked at anyone else. Montag sat in the front seat with Beatty and Black. They did not even smoke their pipes. They sat there looking out in the front of the great salamander as they turned a corner and went silently on. They weren't happy like you. Master Ridley, said Montag at last. What? Said Beatty. She said Master Ridley. She said some crazy thing when we came in the door. Play the man, she said. Master Ridley. Something, something, something. You're right. It is a tragedy that they let that woman burn. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out, said Beatty. Stoneman glanced over at the captain, as did Montag, startled. Beatty rubbed his chin. A man named Latimer said that to a man named Nicholas Ridley as they were being burnt alive in Oxford for heresy on October 16, 1555. Yeah, that's terrible. Montag and Snowman went back to looking at the streets as it moved under the engine wheels. I'm full of bits and pieces, said Beatty. Most fire captains have to be. Sometimes I surprise myself. Watch it, Stoneman! Stoneman braked the truck. Damn, said Beatty. You've gone right by the corner. We'll return for the firehouse. I'm sorry that I said that word in front of you. That's what the book says. I'm sorry that I said the word in front of you guys. And that's the end of what we're going to read. What do you think? Alright, now feels like a great time to stop just for a second and talk about the language that maybe some of us have already noticed in Fahrenheit 451. First of all, do you like my sweatshirt? Because go Nebraska. Just wanted to point that out. Secondly, as you may have noticed in the chunk that I just read, I weirdly emphasized the swear word. I got too close to the camera and I didn't actually mean it to sound like I was glorifying it, and so I apologize. That looks goofier than I meant to. I wanted to slightly emphasize it so we could talk about it, but not to glorify that word at all. So let me just be really clear. The point of this book is not to introduce you to a whole lot of swear words that I want you to start using, because I in fact don't. What I do want you to watch is who and when are using these words. I have a theory, which we'll talk more about later, that oftentimes people use swear words in order to cover deeper thoughts or emotions. So this whole book is about people who are not thinking, who don't allow themselves to think, who try to appear all the same or try to appear one way, even though there's something deeper going on. And I think oftentimes that swear words, just like when we say I'm fine or nothing's wrong or whatever it is, oftentimes we can use language to push people back. And I think that's what's happening a lot. People who want to appear they have it all together, people who want to appear tough, people who want to appear careless, or they're just living in the moment, tend to use these words that I myself would not personally use. So just track that, right? Watch who uses these words and when and why. I think the author put them in here intentionally, and it is not to glorify that language, and is not to have us use it, and I apologize if that's how that came across in that video I made. I just was distracted by that cute baby. But we'll talk more about language. There's your pitch. Enjoy more of the book. Montag and Snowman went back to looking at the street as it moved under the engine wheels. I'm full of bits and pieces, said Beatty. Most fire captains have to be. Sometimes I surprise myself. Watch it, Stoneman! Stoneman braked the truck. Damn, said Beatty. You've gone right by the corner where we turned for the firehouse. Who is it? Who would it be? Said Montag, leaning back against the closed door in the dark. His wife said at last, Well, put on the light. I don't want the light. Come to bed. He heard her roll impatiently. The bed springs squealed. Are you drunk? She said. So it was the hand that started it all. He felt one hand and then the other work his coat free and let it slump to the floor. He held his pants out into an abyss and let them fall into darkness. His hands had been infected, and soon it would be his arms. He could feel the poison working up his wrists and into his elbows and his shoulders, and then the jump over from the shoulder blade to shoulder blade like a spark leaping a gap. His hands were ravenous, and his eyes were beginning to feel hunger, as if they must look at something, anything, everything. His wife said, What are you doing? He balanced in space with the book in his sweating, cold fingers. A minute later she said, Well, don't just stand there in the middle of the floor. He made a small sound.
What? She asked. He made more soft sounds. He stumbled toward the bed and shoved the book clumsily under the cold pillow. He fell into bed and his wife cried out, startled. He lay far across the room from her, on a winter island separated by an empty sea. She talked to him for what seemed a long while, and she talked about this and she talked about that, and it was only words, like the words he had heard once in a nursery at a friend's house, a 2-year-old child building word patterns, talking jargon, making pretty sounds in the air. But Montag said nothing, and after a long while, when he only made the small sounds, he felt her move in the room and come to his bed and stand over him and put her hand down to feel his cheek. He knew that when she pulled her hand away from his face, it was wet. Late in the night, he looked over at Mildred. She was awake. There was a tiny dance of melody in the air. Her seashell was tampered in her ear again, and she was listening to far people in far places, her eyes wide and staring at the fathoms of blackness above her in the ceiling. Wasn't there an old joke about the wife who talked so much on the telephone that her desperate husband ran out to the nearest store and telephoned her to ask what was for dinner? Well then, why didn't he buy himself an audio seashell broadcasting station and talk to his wife late at night? Murmur, whisper, shout, scream, yell. But what would he whisper? What would he yell? What could he say? And suddenly she was so strange he couldn't believe he knew her at all. He was in someone else's house, like those other jokes people told of the gentleman, drunk, coming home late at night, unlocking the wrong door, entering the wrong room, and betting with a stranger and getting up early and going to work, and neither of them the wiser.
Millie? He whispered. What? I didn't mean to startle you. What I want to know is, well, when did we meet? And where? When did we meet for what? She asked. I mean, originally. He knew she must be frowning in the dark. He clarified it. The first time we ever met. Where was it? And when? Why, it was that... She stopped. I don't know, she said. He was cold. Can't you remember? It's been so long. Only 10 years, that's all. Only 10. Don't get excited, I'm trying to think. She laughed an odd little laugh that went up and up. Funny, how funny to not remember where or when you met your husband or wife. He lay, massaging his eyes, his brow, and the back of his neck slowly. He held both hands over his eyes and applied a steady pressure there as if to crush memory into place. It was suddenly more important than any other thing in a lifetime that he knew where he had met Mildred. It doesn't matter. She was up in the bathroom now, and he heard the water running, and the swallowing sound she made. No, I guess not, he said. He tried to count how many times she swallowed, and he thought of the visit from the 2 zinc oxide-faced men with the cigarettes in their straight-lined mouths and the electronic-eyed snake winding down into the layer upon layer of night and stone and stagnant spring water, and he wanted to call out to her, how many have you taken tonight?
How many will you take later and not know? And so on, every hour. Or maybe not tonight, tomorrow night. And me not sleeping tonight or tomorrow night, or any night for a long while, now that this has started. And he thought of her lying on the bed, with the 2 technicians standing straight over her, not bent with concern, but only standing straight, arms folded. And he remembered thinking then that if she died, he was certain he wouldn't cry. For it would be the dying of an unknown, a street face, a newspaper image, and it was suddenly so very wrong that he had begun to cry, not at death, but at the thought of not crying at death. A silly, empty man near a silly, empty woman, while the hungry snake made her still more empty. How do you get so empty, he wondered. Who takes it out of you? And that awful flower, that the other day, the dandelion. It had summed up everything, hadn't it? What a shame. You're not in love with anyone, and why not? Well, wasn't there a wall between him and Mildred when you came down to it? Literally just 1 wall, but so far 3. And expensive, too. And the uncles, the aunts, the cousins, the nieces, the nephews that lived in those walls, the gibbering pack of tree apes that said nothing, 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 and said it loud, loud, loud. He had taken to calling them relatives from the very first. How's Uncle Luis doing? Who? And Aunt Maud? The most significant memory he had of Mildred, really, was of a little girl in a forest without trees. How odd. Or rather, a little girl lost on a plateau, where there used to be trees. You could feel the memory of those shapes all about, sitting in the center of the living room.
The living room. What a good job of labeling that was now. No matter when he came in, the walls were always talking to Mildred. Something must be done. Yes, something must be done. Well, let's not stand and talk. Let's do it. I'm so mad I could spit. What was it all about? Mildred couldn't say. Who was mad at whom? Mildred didn't quite know. What were they going to do? Well, said Mildred, wait around and see. He had waited around to see. A great thunderstorm of sound gushed from the walls. Music bombarded him at such intense volume that his bones were almost shaking from their tendons. He felt his jaw vibrate, his eyes wobble in his head. He was a victim of concussion. When it was all over, he felt like a man who had been thrown from a cliff, whirled in a centrifuge, and spat out over a waterfall that fell into emptiness and never quite touched bottom, not quite touched bottom. And you fell so fast you didn't touch the sides either, never quite touched anything. The thunder faded. The music died. There, said Mildred. And it was indeed remarkable. Something had happened, even though the people in the walls of the room had barely moved and nothing had really been settled. You had the impression that someone had turned on a washing machine or sucked you up into a giant vacuum. You drowned in music and pure cacophony. He came out of this room sweating and on the point of collapse. Behind him, Mildred sat in her chair and the voices went on again. Well, everything will be all right now, said an aunt. Oh, don't be too sure, said a cousin. Now don't get angry. Who's angry? You are. I am. You're mad. Why would I be mad? Because. That's all very well, cried Montague, but what are they mad about? Who are these people? Who's that man and who's that woman? Are they husband and wife? Are they divorced, engaged? What? Good God, nothing's connected up. They, said Mildred, well, they had this fight, you see. They certainly fight a lot. You should listen. I think they're married. Yes, they're married. Why? And if it was not the 3 walls soon to be 4 walls and the dream complete, then it was the open car and Mildred driving 100 miles an hour across town, he shouting at her and she shouting back and both trying to hear what was said but hearing only the scream of the car. At least keep it down to the minimum, he yelled. What? She cried. Keep it down to 55, the minimum, he shouted. The what? She shrieked. Speed, he shouted. And she pushed it up to 105 miles an hour and tore the breath from his mouth. When they stepped out of the car, she had the seashell stuff in her ears. Silence. Only the wind blowing softly. Mildred, he stirred in bed. He reached over and pulled the tiny musical insect out of her ear. Mildred! Mildred! Yes. Her voice was faint. He felt he was one of those creatures electronically inserted between the slots of the photocolor walls, speaking, but the speech not piercing the crystal barrier. He could only pantomime, hoping she would turn his way and see him. They could not touch through the glass. Mildred, do you know that girl I was telling you about? What girl? She was almost asleep. The girl next door. What girl next door? You know, the high school girl. Clarice, her name is. Oh, yes, said his wife. I haven't seen her for a few days. 4 days, to be exact. Have you seen her? No. I meant to talk to you about her. Strange. Oh, I know the one you mean. I thought you would. Her, said Mildred in the dark room. What about her? Asked Montague. I meant to tell you, forgot. Tell me now, what is it? I think she's gone. Gone? Whole family moved out somewhere, but she's gone for good. I think she's dead. We couldn't be talking about the same girl. No, the same girl. McClellan. Run over by a car 4 days ago. I'm not sure, but I think she's dead. The family moved out anyway. I don't know, but I think she's dead. You're not sure of it? No, not sure. Pretty sure. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Forgot. 4 days ago? I forgot all about it. 4 days ago, he said, quietly lying there. They lay there in the dark room, not moving, either of them. Good night, she said. He heard a faint rustle. Her hand moved. The electronic thimble moved like a praying mantis on the pillow, touched by her hand. Now it was in her ear again, humming. He listened and his wife was singing under her breath. Outside the house, a shadow moved, and autumn wind rose up and faded away. But there was something else in the silence that he heard. It was like a breath exhaled upon the window. It was like a faint drift of greenish luminescent smoke, the motion of a single huge October leaf blowing across the lawn and away. The hound, he thought. It's out there tonight. It's out there. If I open up the window... He did not open up the window. He had chills and fever in the morning. You can't be sick, said Mildred. He closed his eyes over the hotness. Yes. But you were all right last night. No, I wasn't all right. He heard the relatives shouting in the parlor. Mildred stood over his bed curiously. He felt her there. He saw her without opening his eyes, her hair burnt by chemicals to be brittle straw, her eyes with a kind of cataract unseen but suspect far behind the pupils, the red and pouting lips, the body as thin as a praying mantis from dieting, and her flesh like white bacon. He could remember her no other way. Will you bring me aspirin and water? You've got to get up, she said. It's noon. You've slept 5 hours later than usual. Will you turn the parlor off? He asked. That's my family. Will you turn it off for a sick man? I'll turn it down. She went out of the room and did nothing to the parlor and came back. Is that better? Thanks. That's my favorite program, she said. What about the aspirin? You've never been sick before. She went away again. Well, I'm sick now. I'm not going to work tonight. Call Beatty for me. You acted funny last night, she returned, humming. Where's the aspirin? He glanced at the water glass she handed him. Oh, she walked to the bath again. Did something happen? A fire is all. I had a nice evening, she said in the bathroom. What doing? The parlor. What was on? Programs. What programs? Some of the best ever. Who? Oh, you know, the bunch. Yes, the bunch, the bunch, the bunch. He pressed at the pain in his eyes, and suddenly the odor of kerosene made him vomit. Mildred came in humming. She was surprised. Why'd you do that? He looked with dismay at the floor. We burned an old woman with her books. It's a good thing the rug's washable. She fetched a mop and worked on it. I went to Helen's last night. Couldn't you get the shows in your own parlor? Sure, but it's nice visiting. She went out into the parlor. He heard her singing. Mildred, he called. She returned singing, snapping her fingers softly. Aren't you going to ask me about last night? He asked. What about it? We burned 1,000 books. We burned a woman. Well, the parlor was exploding with sound. We burned copies of Dante and Swift and Marcus Aurelius. Wasn't he a European? Something like that. Wasn't he a radical? I never read him. He was a radical. Mildred fiddled with the telephone. You don't expect me to call Captain Beatty, do you? You must. Don't shout. I wasn't shouting. Just a quick side note. Again, we see, as we were going back in the beginning, when Clarice was talking about asking questions and how nobody asks questions and how nobody thinks, nobody takes the time to think, this woman is hearing that a woman died last night, and it is not in her nature or her mental state right now to be asking questions or to care that a human being literally died. So again, she's so distracted, she's so caught up in this fantasy world she's created for herself that she is pretty numb to the life of another human, or the death of another human. Montag, was up in bed suddenly, enraged and flushed, shaking. The parlor roared in the hot air. I can't call him. I can't tell him I'm sick. Why? Because you're afraid, he thought. A child feigning illness, afraid to call because after a moment's discussion the conversation would run so, Yes, Captain, I feel better already. I'll be in at 10 o'clock tonight. You're not sick, said Mildred. Montag fell back in bed. He reached under his pillow. The hidden book was still there. Mildred, how would it be if, maybe I quit my job a while? You want to give up everything after all these years of working because one night some woman and her books? You should have seen her, Millie. She's nothing to me. She shouldn't have books. It was her responsibility. She should have thought of that. I hate her. She's got you going, and next thing you know, we'll be out. No house, no job, no nothing. You weren't there. You didn't see, he said. There must be something in books, things we can't imagine, to make a woman stay in a burning house. There must be something there. You don't stay for nothing. Again, feels like an important moment. She was simple-minded. She was as rational as you and I, more so, perhaps, and we burned her. That's water under the bridge. No, not water, fire. You ever seen a burned house? It smolders for days. Well, this fire will last the rest of my life. God, I've been trying to put it out in my mind all night. I'm crazy with trying. You should have thought of that before becoming a fireman. Thought, he said. Was I given a choice? My grandfather and father were firemen. In my sleep, I ran after them. The parlor was playing a dance tune. This is the day you go on the early shift, said Mildred. You should have gone 2 hours ago. I just noticed. It's not just that the woman died, said Montag. Last night I thought about all the kerosene I've used in the past 10 years, and I thought about books, and for the first time I realized that a man was behind each one of those books. A man had to think them up. A man had to take a long time to put them down on paper, and I've never even thought about that before. Crazy the things that happen when we force ourselves to actually think. He got out of bed. It took some man a lifetime maybe to put some of his thoughts down, looking around at the world and life, and then I come along in 2 minutes and boom, it's all over. Let me alone, said Mildred. I didn't do anything. And so this woman who doesn't want her life to be uncomfortable, right? Even though we can look at it and be like, Mildred, your life would be better, but uncomfortable in the moment stops people from doing a lot of really important things. Let you alone. That's all very well, but how can I leave myself alone? We need not to be let alone. We need to be really bothered once in a while. And again, let me say that line. We need to be really bothered once in a while. How long is it since you were really bothered about something important, about something real? That's the moment I feel like he's talking to me as the reader of this book. And then he shut up, for he remembered last week, and the two white stones staring up at the ceiling, and the pump snake with the probing eyes, and the two soap-faced men with the cigarettes moving in their mouths when they talked. But that was another Mildred. That was a Mildred so deep inside this one, and so bothered, really bothered, that the two women had never met. He turned away. Mildred said, "Well, now you've done it. Our front of the house. Look who's here." "I don't care." "There's a Phoenix car just drove up, and a man in a black shirt with an orange snake stitched on his arm coming up the front walk." "Captain Beatty?" he said. "Captain Beatty." Montague did not move, but stood looking into the cold whiteness of the wall immediately before him. "Go, let him in, will you? Tell him I'm sick." "Tell him yourself." She ran a few steps this way, a few steps that, and stopped eyes wide when the front door speaker called her name softly, softly. "Mrs. Montague, Mrs. Montague, someone here, Mrs. Montague, Mrs. Montague, someone's here." And then fading. Montague made sure the book was well hidden behind the pillow, climbed slowly back into bed, arranged the covers over his knees and across his chest, half sitting, and after a while Mildred moved and went out of the room, and Captain Beatty strolled in, his hands in his pockets. "Shut the relatives up," said Beatty, looking around at everything except Montague and his wife. This time Mildred ran. The yammering voices stopped yelling in the parlor. Captain Beatty sat down in the most comfortable chair with a peaceful look on his ruddy face. He took time to prepare and light his brass pipe and puff out a great cloud of smoke. "Just thought I'd come by and see how this sick man is." "How'd you guess?" Beatty smiled a smile which showed only the candy pinkness of his gums and tiny whiteness of his teeth. "I've seen it all. You were going to call for a night off." Montague sat in bed. "Well," said Beatty, "take the night off." He examined his eternal matchbox, the lid of which said, "Guaranteed 1,000,000 light in this igniter," and began to strike the chemical match abstractedly. "Blow out, strike, speak a few words, blow out." He looked at the flame. He blew. He looked at the smoke. When will you be well?" "Tomorrow. The next day, maybe. First of the week." Beatty puffed his pipe. "Every fireman, sooner or later, hits this. They only need understanding to know how the wheels run, need to know the history of our profession. They don't feed it to rookies like they used to. Damn shame." Puff. "Only fire chiefs remember it now." Puff. "I'll let you in on it." Mildred fidgeted. Beatty took a full minute to settle himself and think back for what he wanted to say. "When did it all start, you ask? This job of ours. How did it come about? Where? When?" "Well, I'd say it really got started around a thing called the Civil War, even though our rule book claims it was founded earlier. The fact is, we didn't get along well until photography came into its own. Then, motion pictures in the early 20th century, radio, television, things began to have mass." Montague sat in bed, not moving. "And because they had mass, they became simpler," said Beatty. "Once, books appealed to a few people, here, there, everywhere. They could afford to be different. The world was roomy. But then the world got full of eyes and elbows and mouths, double, triple, quadruple population, films and radios, magazines, books leveled down to a sort of pace-putting norm. Do you follow me?" "I think so." Beatty peered at the smoke pattern he had put on the air. "Picture it. 19th century man with his horses, dogs, carts, slow motion. Then, in the 20th century, speed up your camera, books cut shorter, condensations, digits, tabloids. Everything boils down to the gag, the snap ending." "Snap ending." Mildred nodded. Classics cut to fit 15-minute radio shows, then cut again to fill a 2-minute book column, winding up at last a 10 or 12-line dictionary resume. I exaggerated, of course. The dictionaries were for reference. But many more were those whose sole knowledge of Hamlet, you know the title certainly, Montague, it is probably only a faint rumor of a title to you, Mrs. Montague, whose sole knowledge, as I say, of Hamlet was a one-page digestive in a book that claimed, "Now, at last, you can read all the classics. Keep up with your neighbors. Do you see? Out of the nursery into the college and back to the nursery. There's your intellectual pattern for the past 5 centuries or more." Mildred arose and began to move around the room, picking things up and putting them down. Beatty ignored her and continued. "Speed up the film, Montague, quick. Click, pick, look, I, now, flick, here, there, swift, pace, up, down, in, out, why, how, who, what, where, bang, whap, swallow, bing, bong, boom. Digest, 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 digest. Politics? One column, two sentences, a headline. Then, in midair, all vanishes. Whirl man's mind around so fast that under the pumping hands of publishers, exploiters, broadcasters, that the centrifuge flings off all unnecessary, time-wasting thought. Let me jump back to that. Unnecessary, time-wasting thought. And my question is real thought ever time-wasting? Circle back to that, but kind of keep that idea in the back of your head. I think that the people in charge in this world want people to think that time is wasted when you're thinking. I would have to disagree with that. Mildred smoothed the bedclothes. Montag felt his heart jump and jump again as she patted his pillow. Right now, she was pulling at his shoulder to try to get him to move so she could take the pillow out and fix it nicely and put it back. And perhaps cry out and stare or simply reach down her hand and say, "What's this?" and hold up the hidden book with touching innocence. School is shortened, discipline relaxed, philosophies, histories, languages dropped, English and spelling gradually neglected, finally almost completely ignored. Life is immediate. The job counts. Pleasure lies all about after work. Why learn anything save pressing buttons, pulling switches, fitting nuts and bolts? "Let me fix your pillow," said Mildred. "No," whispered Montag. The zipper displaces the button, and a man lacks just that much time to think while dressing at dawn. A philosophical hour, and thus a melancholy hour. Mildred said, "Here." "Get away," said Montag. "Life becomes one big pratfall, Montag. Everything, bang, boff, and wow." "Wow," said Mildred, yanking at the pillow. "For God's sake, let me be!" cried Montag passionately. Beatty opened his eyes wide. Mildred's hand had frozen behind the pillow. Her fingers were tracing the book's outline, and as the shape became familiar, her face looked surprised and then stunned. Her mouth opened to ask a question. Empty the theater, save for clowns, and furnish the rooms with glass walls and pretty colors running up and down the walls like confetti, or blood, or sherry, or sauterne. "You like baseball, don't you, Montag?" "Baseball's a fine game." Now Beatty was almost invisible, a voice somewhere behind a screen of smoke. "What's this?" asked Mildred, almost with delight. Montag heaved back against her arm. "What's this here?" "Sit down!" Montag shouted. She jumped away, her hands empty. "We're talking!" Beatty went on as if nothing had happened. "You like bowling, don't you, Montag?" "Bowling, yes." "And golf?" "Golf's a fine game. Basketball? A fine game. Billiards, pool, football? Fine games, all of them." "More sports for everyone, group spirit, fun, and you don't have to think, Organize and super sports. More cartoons and books, more pictures. The mind drinks less and less. Impatience. Highways full of crowds going somewhere. Nowhere. The gasoline refuge. Towns turn into motels. People in nomadic surges from place to place, following the moon tides, living tonight in the room where you slept this noon and I the night before." Mildred went out of the room and slammed the door. The parlor aunts began to laugh at the parlor uncles. "Now, let's take up the minorities in our civilization, shall we? Bigger the population, the more minorities. Don't step on the toes of the dog lovers, the cat lovers, doctors, lawyers, merchants, chiefs, Mormons, Baptists, Unitarians, second-generation Chinese, Swedes, Italians, Germans, Texans, Brooklynites, Irishmen, people from Oregon or Mexico. The people in this book, this play, this TV serial are not meant to represent any actual painters, cartographers, mechanics, anywhere. The bigger your market, Montag, the less you handle controversy. Remember that. All the minor minorities with their navels to be kept clean. Authors full of evil thoughts, like lock up your typewriters. They did. Magazines became a nice blend of vanilla tapioca. Books, so the damned snobbish critics say, were dishwater. No wonder books stopped selling, the critics said, but the public, knowing what it wanted, spinning happily, let the comic books survive. And the three-dimensional sex magazines, of course, there you have it, Montag. It didn't come from the government down. There was no dictum, no declaration, no censorship to start with, no technology. Mass exploitation and minority pressure carried the trick, thank God. Today, thanks to them, you can stay home happy all the time. You are allowed to read comics, the good old confessionals, or trade journals. So just so this, I think this part is kind of confusing. Just to be clear, basically what he's saying is real thought can offend someone. right? Real thought can represent or misrepresent a minority or a people who share a different thought. Real thought makes people uncomfortable. And so he says that people slowly just started to want to stop thinking, wanted to stop engaging with things that were hard or difficult to talk about. So he says this is what people want. People want simply to be entertained. People want vanilla garbage to be put in front of them because they don't want to actually have to think or struggle or deal with anything that is sort of real at all. Yes. What about the firemen then? Asked Montag. Beatty leaned forward in the faint mist of smoke from this pipe. What more easily explained and natural? With school turning out more runners, jumpers, racers, tinkerers, grabbers, snatchers, flyers, and swimmers, instead of examiners, critics, knowers, and imaginative creators, the word intellectual, of course, became the swear word it deserved to be. So he's saying the word intellectual, the word that means a person who thinks deeply about things, became a swear word, became an evil word, became a word that people wouldn't say, and he said it deserved to be, because people shouldn't actually be thinking about hard things. You always dread the unfamiliar. Surely you remember the boy in your own school class who was exceptionally bright, did most of the reciting and answering, while the others sat like so many leaden idols, hating him. And wasn't it this bright boy you selected for beatings and tortures after hours? Of course it was. We must all be alike. Not everyone born free and equal, as the Constitution says, but everyone made equal. Each man the image of each other. Then all are happy, for there are no mountains to make them cower, to judge themselves against. I just want to stop and I want you to think about that. Would life be better if everyone was the same? Not if everyone was equal, but if everyone was the same. Right? I think there's a difference between like sameness and equality. And I would argue very strongly against what the captain is saying here, that like being the same, if we were all the same, we would not, life would be worse if we were all the same. It would be more boring. It might appear to be easier, but I think life would be terrible if we were all the same. Let's be clear. So, a book is a loaded gun in the house next door. Burn it. Take the shot from the weapon. Breach man's mind. Who knows who might be the target of the well-read man? Me? I won't stomach them for a minute. And so when houses were finally fireproof completely all over the world, you were correct in your assumption the other night. There was no longer need of firemen for the old purposes. They were given the new job as custodians of our peace of mind, the focus of our understandable and rightful dread of being inferior. Officials, censors, judges, and executioners. That's you, Montag, and that's me. So to be clear, he says, a book is a loaded gun in a person's hand. I don't want a person to think and turn that thought against me, right? I don't want someone to learn something and then try to teach me something, because sometimes that's uncomfortable, because learning things changes the way I live. So he says that the firemen, in destroying knowledge, are keeping the peace of mind. They're helping people continue with their same way of life so they don't have to think, so their ways of thinking don't have to be challenged at all, which sounds terrible, I think. Sounds easy in some ways, but terrible. Wrong, I would say. It sounds wrong. The door to the parlor opened, and Mildred stood there, looking in at them, looking at Beatty and then at Montag. Behind her, the walls of the room were flooded with green and yellow and orange fireworks, sizzling and bursting to some music composed almost completely of trap drums, tom-toms, and cymbals. Her mouth moved, and she was saying something, but the sound covered it. Beatty knocked his pipe into the palm of his pink hand, studied the ashes as if they were a symbol to be diagnosed and searched for meaning. You must understand that our civilization is so vast that we can't have our minorities upset and stirred. Ask yourself, what do we want in this country above all? People want to be happy. Isn't that right? Haven't you heard it all your life? I want to be happy, people say. Well, aren't they? Don't we keep them moving? Don't we give them fun? That's all we live for, isn't it? For pleasure, for titillation, and you must admit our culture provides plenty of these. Yes. And that's where we're going to stop, but I want you to maybe like ask someone that you know, ask one of your parents or ask a friend ask them maybe what's the point of life, right? What's your deepest desire in life? Because what the captain is saying here is everyone's deepest desire is to be happy. And I would argue deeply against that, but I want you to think about that thought. When you talk about that thought, we're going to circle back to it. So have that conversation now with someone who you think is wise, because I do not think that happiness is our end goal at all. And that's where we will stop.